Welcome to Coast Vue, the show that every single day celebrates the men and women who are making coastal Mississippi, and Mississippi for that matter, such a great place to live, work, and play. Look, it's been a great week here on SuperTalk. We've had so many incredible guests. And, and then I looked at the schedule for next week, and we've got so many new guests, so many incredible people who are making such a mark here in coastal Mississippi to make this a better place to live, work, and play. And I want to thank you for joining us. As I often say, the numbers for the show continue to climb. The social media engagement around the show is just terrific. I really appreciate you paying attention. And we do this every day. We do it Monday through Friday, and a new guest, long-form conversations, and a great way to learn about what it takes to build a great community. Hey, listen, throughout my career, I've had the opportunity to work with some amazing journalists. I've had responsibilities for newspapers from Louisiana to Florida, and I've been publisher of 3 separate newspapers along the way. And, you've had the opportunity to meet some of them here on this show. Kate McGandy, who used to work at the Sun Herald and now works for WXXV. I've had Blake on, who's the general manager now at the Sun Herald. And, just a long stretch of people. Of course, Roland Weeks, my predecessor at the Sun Herald. From my time in Louisiana, they're working with the NOLA Media Group and NOLA.com at the Times-Picayune, and I met so many incredible journalists. I was surrounded by talent, Pulitzer Prize winners. You've met many of them here on this show. James O'Byrne, who is living in the countryside of France now, comes on regularly to talk about the changing media landscape. I just love spending time with James. He's such a smart guy. Mark Schlesstein, just an incredibly talented environmental writer, multiple prize winner, just incredible. Jeff Duncan, who's here every single Friday. And we talk about the Saints and the Pelicans and whatever else might be on Jeff's mind, and others. But I'm pleased to have someone today, someone I got to know really well while I was in Louisiana. He's a Pulitzer Prize-winning photojournalist, and his name is Ted Jackson, and he is from Mississippi, and we're going to talk about that Mississippi connection here shortly. But let me start by just saying good morning to you, Ted. How you doing, my friend?
Good morning. Doing great.
It's good to see you. Good to see you doing well. You were at an event last night, and certainly we're going to talk about this here in just a second, about your book, a very special book about a man who was a NFL football player who played in multiple Super Bowls, who you found on the streets of New Orleans as a homeless man, and has sort of unlocked a series of events. A close relationship between you and Jackie Wallace, the man's name, and led to a book, led to an incredible photojournalistic effort on your part. But I think that story specifically tells as much about yourself as it does about Jackie, about the form of photojournalism that you practice, your connection to your subjects, the way you immerse your heart and soul in your work is more than just taking a picture. You're very immersive about what you do. Have you always been like that, Ted?
I think that's why I got into photojournalism. I love telling stories. I love connecting with people, and when I find the right story, I can just immerse myself into it and feel the heart of it. I was often kidded early on in my career that some photographers would say, just go shoot the picture and move on to the next day, and the next day starts fresh. And I was never like that. A lot of my colleagues were not like that either. But you made connections with people and stayed with them, and the stories through the years would unfold. And if you had those connections, then you could keep going back. I remember my first job in newspapers was in New Iberia, and I felt like I was going to be there about 2 years. That was just kind of my notion at the time, the Daily Iberian. And I found a Cajun couple who I just connected with, that lived on the edge of the swamps, and I visited with them every chance I had, between assignments, after assignments, early in the morning, on weekends, whatever. And ironically, I kept the story secret from my editors because I didn't want them to pull it when they had an empty space. And so I just kind of kept it a quiet notion of mine and worked on it for 2 years.
Wow.
And when I gave my 2 weeks notice to come to the Times-Picayune, that I unveiled that essay, and that was kind of my swan song. But I've always done that, and Jackie was no different.
Well, we'll talk more about Jackie's story here in a second, but you were born in Macomb, Mississippi, went to the University of Southern Mississippi. Where in your life did you realize that photojournalism was going to be your thing?
I was in college. I went to junior college at Southwest Junior College in Summit for a couple of years, and there I met a great friend, Steve Gardner, who became my roommate. And after the first semester, we joined together as roommates. And I was an architecture major. I was taking drafting. And Steve was a journalism major. And one weekend brought home a borrowed camera, 35 millimeter camera. And because I was into art, I love to draw. And he just kind of laid the camera on his desk and said, "Hey, anytime you want to use this, just pick it up and roll with it." And I did, and we would work together in the darkroom at the school and learn how to print, and I fell in love with it. Like I may have said earlier, I've always been a storyteller, and whether that was going to be through art or just or telling stories or finding the right medium, photography fit that notion perfectly. And so it took a while. It took a couple of years, but I finally figured out that journalism was my role.
Well, there's so many great examples of your photojournalism. Desire, Death of Dream, about the Desire Housing Project. People in coastal Mississippi have heard of Desire and what that's all about. But the way you immersed yourself there, I remember when I was at the Sun Herald. It wasn't long before I became publisher. I remember the Oceans of Trouble series that the Times-Picayune did, but man, that was a massive undertaking. It wasn't, once I got over there and really started to study that specific effort, it wasn't just a story about coastal, Gulf Coast. It was a story about the world's fisheries and the kind of investment that the Times-Picayune made in that effort, which ultimately, I should add, led to a Pulitzer Prize for Public Service in 1997. Man, that was a special project to be a part of, wasn't it?
It was, and it started small. Well, it started big, but not as big as it ended up being. They formed the team of Mark Schlefstein, you mentioned earlier, John McQuaid, and myself as a photographer, and Bob Marshall later joined us on the sports side of the fisheries. But it started out as a 3-month project, and get out there and try to understand what was happening with the fish stocks in the Gulf of Mexico, the depletion of the fish stocks, and what the problems were. And after 3 months, the team quietly came together and said, "What do you have?" And we all said, "We don't have it yet." It was kind of sweat and bullets kind of a moment. I don't have the pictures I need. I know I don't have it, and everybody said the same thing. And so we went and asked for more time. And they basically said, I mean, the dream of photojournalism, especially and journalism in general, is, they gave us all the time we needed. They gave us all the resources we needed and just said, go. And we need to develop this story, figure out what the issues are, which we learned that the problems in the Gulf of Mexico were being echoed throughout the world. And so if we need to go to Thailand, go to Thailand. If you need to go to Japan, go to Japan. If you need to go to Florida, whatever it meant. My great remembrance was I was finally told by an editor, "Ted, if you need a helicopter, just go get it."
Hey, but Ted, you know what? Don't you wish that those days of journalism were still here? And they're so important. Imagine the number of resources just in general from newspapers that were engaged in community nationally, internationally, across this nation, say even 20, 25 years ago. It really made a difference, didn't it?
It did. It really did. And those are important stories. And people don't go looking for things like that. They discover them when it's presented properly, and pull them in to stories that they, people these days on news sites, they tend to, in my opinion, they go to a site and look for the stories that they are interested in. You don't open the front page and
the serendipity that was
exactly.
so important.
You don't get that anymore.
When we come back on the other side, we're going to continue our conversation with Pulitzer Prize-winning photojournalist Ted Jackson, who's from Mississippi, went to the University of Southern Mississippi, and we're going to talk about this very unique story of Jackie Wallace. But before that, we're going to talk just a bit about Katrina. We'll see you after this break. Welcome back to Coast Vue. We're visiting with Pulitzer Prize-winning photojournalist Ted Jackson, who is from Mississippi. He had a long and incredible career at the Times-Picayune. He does a lot of journalism work these days, and he's just a special guy. He's a guy who, as I said at the beginning of the show, pours his heart and soul into his projects. But, among the many awards that you've gotten, I retired in 2016, Ted. But in 2017, you were awarded the Amos Award for your timeless journalism has earned the trust of community and the respect of your colleagues. And I'm very partial to that award because, as you know, Jim Amos and I, the former executive editor and the vice president of editorial and content for NOLA Media Group, he was someone that was extremely important to me. And what a wonderful distinction to get that award, Ted. And I'm not surprised at all that you got it.
Well, I was surprised.
Yeah.
They made sure that I was there to photograph the event when they held the official ceremony, and when my name was called, I just stood there stunned. But yeah, that holds a very special place in my heart and in my bookcase. Because it's from my colleagues. It's
yeah, very, 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 very special. Hey, listen, we're gonna turn the page here quickly, and I can't help but mention that the Sun Herald won a gold medal Pulitzer Prize for public service, and so did the Times-Picayune in the wake of Hurricane Katrina. We may never see what you and I observed our teams doing after that storm ever again, because the role that the newspaper can play in helping a community come to grips with what it's facing and then find their way through to the other side. The resources that were deployed in that. At one point, incidentally, I asked a question as publisher of the Sun Herald. I asked the question: how many people from Knight Ridder, the owner of the Sun Herald, how many people from Knight Ridder are here right now? Because I asked them every time someone appeared, I wanted to see them, I wanted to meet them, and when they left, I wanted to say thank you on the way out. But in that moment, there were 67 people at the Sun Herald from Knight Ridder here to help.
Wow.
But the way the resources came together to cover the aftermath was it was a life-changing event, wasn't it, Ted?
It was, and Katrina was the storm that almost broke me. I was a veteran of covering hurricanes. I had really good technique and processes and scenarios of how to deal with whatever would come my way. But that was different in your own hometowns and swallowing the homes of your friends and colleagues and with no hope in the future. You couldn't see past the next day. And that led to a lot of chaos, not only, with the residents. I always say that everybody that lived in New Orleans had a part of New Orleans at that time, if they stayed or if they evacuated, whatever, everybody has an incredible story to tell. And in the preceding years after Katrina, everybody wanted to tell it. And so there was an amazing times. And I'm glad I was there, but I would never want to do it again.
I say that often myself. It was made me a better person, a better leader. It helped me understand that we often said that newspapers had a vital role in society to help keep democracy viable. But we actually got to see that on the ground, the importance of providing that news and information to residents so they could sort through all these complex, decisions they had to make, from flood maps to insurance to rebuilding costs to, you name it. Yeah. How do I make a decision to stay? Right. And how do I make a decision to go? I mean, these were all important contemplations. Hey, listen, speaking of connecting, your editor sent you to take a picture of a homeless camp. When you got there, it wasn't there. But you noticed across the street this tiny little setup, and you took a picture. And you noticed a lot of things about this tidy environment. And you had now what was an incredible conversation with a man by the name of Jackie Wallace that in a lot of ways changed your life as much as it changed his. Tell people about that real quick.
Yeah, it was a homeless camp that was set up under the Carrollton overpass that my editor, Kurt Muchler, asked me to go check out. Nothing expected. So I went there and it was all messed up. But on the way back to the car, I almost stumbled over this guy. And the camp was so tidy, neat. He even had a newspaper folded to the on the edge of his little homemade bed. And I shot the picture, just not thinking much of it, because it was just a tidy, homeless. It was so ironic looking. But I woke him up to ask him a question about the other camp, and that's when he said, "You ought to do a story about me." And I asked him why, and he said, "Because I've played in 3 Super Bowls." And it was one of those incredible moments, literally incredible, that you don't believe. And the strange thing was that I didn't even recognize his name when he told me his name was Jackie Wallace. It meant nothing to me. I didn't know. So I went back to the newsroom, and every head popped up when I asked about this man, and they said, "Yeah, he was All-American, played in the NFL, and was in actually 2 Super Bowls, but he was on the team for 3, but nobody knows where he is anymore." And so that's how that started, and we headed back with I went back with Jimmy Smith, a reporter who was ironically, which is the irony of ironies here, is that he had just published that day the 3rd in a series of sports heroes. Where are they today? And interesting enough, that was the page that Jackie's newspaper was turned to, that was laying by his elbow. And even more ironic and strange is that the last of the 3-day series was about Joe Ehrman, who was a teammate on the Baltimore Colts. So when you think about it, he got the newspaper every day as a homeless man, as a crack addict, and read the paper every day. And he read a story about his good old buddy who had gotten out of the NFL, folded the paper, laid down, went to sleep, and woke up with a journalist standing over him. And so naturally he would say, "Here's this series. You ought to do a story about me."
Well, look, I wish we had, as I said, I wish we had taken an hour to tell this whole story, but I can't help but say, and the rest of the story is this. So why don't you kind of get to the punchline and tell sort of where all this ended up going?
Well, it turned into a newspaper story that Friday. Jackie was whisked off the streets by his old teammates and ended up in a rehab clinic in Baltimore, of all places. And over the years, we just became friends. We just made that connection, and he would call me every Thanksgiving morning and thank me for what I meant to him, and we would talk about what he meant to me, and how how many amazing life stories I learned, how many amazing stories of faith in God and what God has done for us in our lives. And we both believe to this day that God put us in that place, not only put us in the place, but taught us, Jackie, to play football, and me to be a photojournalist so that we would meet that day. And we talk about that a lot, about the serendipity of the moment being a God thing. And we're still friends.
It led to a book.
It led to a book. And when when I wrote a follow-up story, it's a really long, fascinating story about the ups and downs of addiction, the NFL, the inner workings of drugs, and the inner workings of faith, the inner workings of CTE, what that does to a football player's brain, and when I wrote a follow-up story for the newspaper, it was an instant viral sensation. I had never seen anything like it. The most read story in the history of the Times-Picayune. And when that landed on the desk of a literary agent in New York, at the same time that my proposal for a book, the same day, Ricky, the same day, and she calls me up and she says, "Holy cow!" And yeah, there's a book in this.
Well, look, here's what I want to do. Jeff Duncan, our friend, is going to be joining us on the other side. So he usually is here every Friday to chat about, the Saints and where they are. I'm going to ask you to hang around for a second and join Jeff and me for the beginning of that conversation, so that the three of us can visit for a few minutes. You got a second to do that?
That'd be awesome. Yeah, absolutely.
Okay. That will be awesome. So, hey, when we come back, we're going to continue our conversation with Pulitzer Prize-winning photojournalist from Mississippi, Ted Jackson, and we'll be joined by Pulitzer Prize-winning and won about every other kind of sports award you can possibly award, Jeff Duncan. We'll see you after this. Welcome back to Coast Vue. When I saw a post from Jamie Bates, who's been on this show many times, he also has a servant's heart. His ability to connect in a photojournalistic way is just incredible. I think about Jamie, when you tell your story about how you connect with people and stay connected, et cetera. But when I saw that, I thought I got to get Ted on the show. And what we're going to do, Ted and I are actually going to plan a show. We're going to come back and tell the entire backstory to this conversation, or this book that he wrote around Jackie Wallace, because it's a fascinating story. I think you'll enjoy hearing it. And here is a Mississippian who's done really well. But before the show started, Jeff Duncan, good morning to you, Jeff. How you doing this morning?
Morning, guys. Thanks for having me on.
Yeah, this is Jeff's day on the show, but Ted and Jeff go back a long way. Turns out the book that I've talked about many times that Jeff's in the process of writing with Steve Gleason, which is not a book about ALS, it's a book about life. And of course, Jeff and I've talked about that. It turns out that along the way, Ted's taking some photos of Steve Gleason. And I just thought it'd be a great little connection here to talk about where you are with your book and how talented Ted is in taking a subject like Steve Gleason and creating some really special images. What's your thoughts about that, Jeff?
Well, there's no doubt. I mean, Ted was the first person we thought of when we got the assignment to spend a day with Steve. We knew that Ted had experience and worked with Steve and Michelle before, but more than anything, Ted has an extraordinary eye for portrait photography, the best I've ever worked with in that regard. Just incredible perceptiveness toward humanity. And there's just, it takes a certain photographer with that skill set to work in that situation. Steve and Michelle love Ted. They have great respect for him. So we had an incredible day. I think Ted would admit, I mean, that day we spent basically documenting a day in the life of Steve Gleason for the readers at The Athletic at the time, I think was an extraordinarily profound day, because we got to see from the minute that Steve Gleason got up in the morning to when he went to bed at night, what his life is like. And it is unbelievable. This man does this every single day of his life. And it was incredible that they let us into that world and showed us, because there were some extremely vulnerable occasions for Steve, and he was willing to share that with the public.
Ted, did you realize when you were in that moment, of course, I mean, this is kind of an obvious question, but our obvious answer, that you're in not only a vulnerable moment for Steve, but you're in the presence of a man who's really defining life. Did you feel that when you're around him?
Well, when I first walked in, they were getting dressed and having his breakfast, which meant pouring, gruel into a tube. And I've been around a lot of things before, and that didn't shock me, but it shocked me that it was my introduction, before any ground rules had been established. And I looked at Steve and I looked at his therapist and I said, before I shoot anything, I need to know what my parameters are. What are the expectations from you? And Steve said through his synthesizer, there are no limits. And that's a gift for someone to open their lives to you like that. And so I delicately shot that moment, but as moments went on and as he was getting dressed, ended up, with Steve being rolled into the shower, and I'm thinking, what's going on here? What kind of pictures can I shoot that's delicate and very meaningful, and to watch the therapist work with him, and dressing him and everything were powerful moments. They were just powerful. And Steve was okay. And because he trusted me, and that's the responsibility a photojournalist gets in that kind of moment. So, people often get the idea that if you do certain things in certain order, and if you live a certain kind of life, and you surround yourself with certain people, and you have enough money, and you do this, do that, then your life is going to be great, and you're going to just skate through with rainbows and never having trouble. Well, that's not what life is about. And once we understand that and accept that about our own paths and start welcoming whatever comes our way, because the answer to life is about how we deal with these things. Steve is the example, right? He shows us the grace and the poise and the impact that you can have even in times of horrible circumstances. It's just a wonderful example to see, and I'm so glad Jeff's writing this book and being a part of that.
I can't help but think, Jeff, that as we celebrated Martin Luther King Jr.'s birthday this past week, or this week, excuse me, one of the things he said is life's most persistent and urgent question is, what are you doing for others? And Steve Gleason could not be any more selfless in the way he presented himself to Ted and the way he's focused on this book, because his 100% desire in life now is to help others however he can.
100%. I mean, I just had this conversation with Steve and Michelle yesterday about our book project, and they're adamant that this is not a Hallmark greeting card book. They want to expose all their human flaws. I mean, Steve will constantly say, you're making me out to be too much of a hero. I want to show the world that I'm flawed and I have weaknesses just like everyone else. That's how you resonate with people. They can identify with someone like Steve going through this terrible, adversity that he and Michelle. And I think it's important to note Michelle is very much a part of this book. I mean, she's a strong character in our book, and Steve wants it that way. I mean, really, it's more their story than just Steve's story. And they both are incredible in what Ted said earlier about allowing us into their world and willingness to be open and candid and vulnerable. I mean, that is a true gift. Very few people are willing to do that, but they know that is what is necessary to connect with everybody and to make an impact on people's lives. And that's what they want out of this book more than anything else, impact people's lives. So when they come into these adverse situations, and it's probably not going to be nearly as extraordinarily challenging as ALS is, but whatever, this book is about handling life, as Ted said, and Steve and Michelle are a shining example of that.
One last question, Ted, before we move on. This notion of legacy and greatness and the power of the human spirit, when you sense all those things in Steve's presence, you realize you're part of something that's so much greater than yourself, don't you?
No doubt. And just being there and watching the day-to-day activities, we went with him to the Saints game that on a Monday night and walked with him, in the park when his wheelchair is stuck in the mud and Michelle's pushing and Son Rivers is trying on his Gleason jersey. And, those quiet moments, you just see such a presence. And Jeff, you'll remember, I was so humbled at dinner time when Steve, before they ate, he asked the question, what was your greatest challenge today and how did you deal with it? And went around the table, and everyone responded what that answer would be. And I had to answer too.
Yep.
And it was a powerful moment. That's the way Steve lives. He wants other people to understand that there's some power within you that is greater than yourself, and we're part of something much bigger.
Hey, Jeff, just one final thought about Ted. I said to him when we were off the air that he has a smoothness about him. I said smooth as silk, but God, you see the connection between his art of photojournalism, his role as a photojournalist, and the connection it has to his heart and soul. He wears it on his sleeve and you can see it. It's there for everybody to see, but it also results in images that are incredibly special.
Yeah, I think Ted would agree. I mean, journalism, photojournalism, it's all just a people business, and how you deal with people and the respect that you show to your subjects. You earn that trust, as Ted has with Steve and Michelle and all of his subjects. But it really gets down to just relationships and how you treat others. And Ted's as good as anybody I've ever worked with in that regard, and it shows in the quality of his work.
Boy, does it. Hey, Ted, bless you, my friend. I hope you have continued success. I look forward to having you back on Coast Vue in the next week or two. We'll talk in more detail the backstory for Jackie Wallace. But until then, have a great day, my friend.
Anytime. Thank you, guys. Great seeing you.
You bet. Hey, when we come back in the final segment, we'll squeeze in a little bit what's the latest in the Saints world. We'll see you after this.